So today we're going to talk about how the Civil War actually got started. Now a lot of people seem to get confused about what the difference is between the United States and the Confederate States. So this is a little key to help you figure that out. Now whenever we talk about the United States of America, oftentimes we'll refer to them as the Union or the Union Army. They'll also be referred to as the Yankees as well, or possibly even the Blue Coats, which is based upon the color of their uniform. Now, the Confederate States of America are often referred to as the Rebels. Sometimes they'll be nicknamed Johnny Reb. Sometimes they'll often be called Secesh, for secessionist. But most commonly, we'll talk about them as the CSA, or the Confederate States of America. Well, the seceding states, they formed something called the Confederate States of America. And one of their first acts was to have a president, and Jefferson Davis became their first and only president of the Confederate States. And they also signed into effect their own version of the Constitution, which they based basically on the United States Constitution, but with a couple glaring differences from the U.S. Constitution. They put in some stuff about their protecting slavery and also talking about respecting states' rights. Now, the Civil War is not something that just happened overnight. People didn't just wake up one morning saying, hey, let's have a Civil War. There were a lot of things that led to it. And so you'll see just a few of the events here. You got the Missouri Compromise, you got Nat Turner's Rebellion, the Underground Railroad, the publication of Uncle Tom's Cabin, Compromise of 1850, the Fugitive Slave Act, the situation that was going on in Kansas, the Dred Scott decision, John Brown's raid, all the way up to the secession of the Southern states, leading to the development of the Civil War. And I like to think of the Civil War as being like a giant stick of dynamite, and all of these events were, part of the fuse. Now, these weren't all the events. There were other things that were going on too, but these are some of the highlights. Well, this is a map of what we would have looked like in about 1860, 1861. And as you can see, these are the Confederate States of America here. These are the ones that seceded from the Union. We got the Union up here, the United States of America. You got the kind of the territories, and then you got way over here, you got California, kind of off on its own. Now, one significant thing are the border states right here. Now, these border states were going to play a crucial role in the Civil War because they really didn't have allegiance to the Union or the Confederacy. So both sides were trying their best to kind of sway the people within those states, because those are going to be really important states for whoever won the war. Now, leading up to the outbreak of the actual war in Fort Sumter, the Confederate States of America, they were going along the seaboard, eastern seaboard of the United States, all around Florida, and on up into the Gulf of Mexico. And they were seizing Union forts, ones that had been left over from years past, and they were taking over these forts so that they would have a stronger defense system. Now, things came to a head, especially in around this area where Charleston, South Carolina was. This is where the Civil War officially got kicked off in April of 1861. Of course, with everything that had gone on throughout the 1800s, you had to have a spark that would finally lead to the outbreak of the Civil War. And this spark occurred on April 12, 1861, with the attack on Fort Sumter. Now, the story goes is that Major Robert Anderson, this really serious-looking guy right here, he was kind of hanging out at this area called Fort Moultrie. And he knew that Fort Sumter, which was in the middle of Charleston Harbor, would serve as a major defensive position. And so what he did was he secretly moved his troops over to Fort Sumter and took it over. Now, there was a problem in Fort Sumter, though. Since it was not yet completed, it also lacked the proper supplies. And so Robert Anderson had called upon Abraham Lincoln to deliver supplies, which Lincoln was in the middle of doing so. Now, before those supplies could actually get there, PGT Beauregard over here, he opened fire on Fort Sumter on April 12, 1861, basically at the crack of dawn in the very early morning hours. And he continued to bombard Fort Sumter for over 34 hours. Now, the poor guys here at Fort Sumter, they really didn't have enough supplies to really fight back. And so after that 34, 36-hour period, they eventually had to give up the fort to the Confederacy. So this is an artist's representation of the attack on Fort Sumter. And you'll notice lots of fiery carnage going on around here. Now this is probably just a little bit more dramatic than it actually was, but it's still a decent representation anyway. Now, after the 34-hour bombardment, the Union did have to cede control to the Confederacy. And the strange thing is, despite all this fiery mayhem that was being portrayed here, there was not a single death associated with the actual battle. Now, there were 2 deaths after the Union gave up. They had requested that they be able to give a 100-gun salute to signal their departure. And in the middle of this whole thing, there was a misfiring of one of the weapons, and it ended up killing two of the Union soldiers inside. But they're not considered actual victims of the battle on Fort Sumter. Now, as a result of what happened here in Charleston Harbor, this set in motion a whole series of events that finally led us into a full-on Civil War. And that's probably the most important thing to remember about Fort Sumter. Well, I always like going to see historic sites as they look today. And these are some pictures from my visit at Fort Sumter. I'll admit, I didn't take this one. I wasn't in a helicopter, but I did take this one because you can see little Paul Revere right there. But Fort Sumter is part of the National Park Service today. And if you're in Charleston and you look off in the distance in the middle of Charleston Harbor, you'll be able to spot it faintly. But in order to get there, you have to take a 45-minute ferry ride to get out there, which I highly recommend because it's really a beautiful spot to visit, even if you're not there for the Civil War aspect of it. So for your consideration, do you think that with everything that I talked about with the fighting at Fort Sumter, do you think it would have been at all possible to have avoided an all-out war?